Hi, I'm Andrew Scheps, and I'm here at Waves, and we're going to talk a little bit about how I use the Scheps 73. The opportunity to do this plugin was great. And, I was a little worried, like, would anybody care? Or, I knew it was going to be a good sounding plugin because we'd spent so much time working on the sound of it. But apparently it's done really well, and a lot of people really like it. I love that style of EQ. And the 1073 is sort of the best of them for tracking. I think it's what was in a lot of the BCM 10s and that style console, which is what was around in a lot of places while I was tracking. So the idea of taking all the advances that had happened in modeling hardware, and it seemed to be right at the time where modeling all of a sudden had sort of made a leap forward, and it was really component-based and really getting the interaction of all of the parts of the circuit as opposed to approximating parts of the circuit or just taking the circuit as one big block to see what it did. It's really going in and seeing what every tiny little piece does, including input transformers and output transformers and the fader. So being able to go through all of that and the way that EQ affects sound was, first of all, very eye-opening for me as we were developing to really see how everything affected everything else. But then also to get to a finished product which just feels like the hardware to me. That was big. That style of EQ is something I will reach for quite a bit because it's a very musical EQ, and I just know the frequencies to the point where I think of, with a kick or a snare, I know that I'm going to use the high shelf on both. I'll probably use some 7.2 on the snare. The 220 is the body of the snare, and on the kick, either the 30 or the 60 with the high-pass filter set at 50. Like, those are sort of go-to starting places that I would use on the hardware, and then I would also use in the software. So I probably use it on kick and snare almost all the time. Sometimes I'll use it on vocal just for the shelf. Then it's also just in the toolbox. So whenever I'm trying to EQ something, and I don't want it to be particularly mid-rangey, but I know I want to control the low end and then mess with the highs a little bit. That's the first style of EQ I'll think of, and now that's the plugin that I know the best. And it's also because I know that I can start cranking the preamp or just the input fader and get a little bit of harmonic distortion out of it at the same time. Because sometimes I'll get things to mix and the recording is good, but there's just something a little bit boring about it. And so you just want to add a little bit of harmonic distortion to it. Just makes it sound a little bit more interesting. It makes it blend in with less EQ. And then the other thing that I use it for quite a bit and more now as I get my head around it more is the MS EQing. Just the concept of EQing mid-side is weird to an engineer who's only really worked on hardware. In hardware land, you would have to have an encoder and a decoder on either side of it, but why not build that into the plugin, because it's part of what Waves has been doing with a lot of the other plugins. So to be able to start thinking about EQ in that mode, it's really eye-opening. So you start to hear things differently. You start to hear the sides versus the middle of a piano or of a drum kit or of a whole mix. It is definitely something I go for as a musical EQ, but in sort of an almost surgical way because I'm dealing with components of the sound that you don't normally get to separate. Let's say a stereo piano, and it's not the only instrument in the track, but it needs to be kind of big and it needs to be a big part of the mix, but you also have a bass and a kick drum and all kinds of other things. You want that piano to be wide and big, but it can't just obliterate everything else. And piano has lots and lots of frequency content, especially in the sort of lower mids to the upper mids. It can start to get really thick depending on the part, obviously. So the ability to start thinking about a piano, not in terms of just the frequency content, but in terms of the middle and the sides, and go in, set it to mid-side, and let's say, for instance, in the middle, high pass the piano 100 to 200, somewhere in there, and add some mid-range that's maybe above or below the vocal, But then on the sides, add all the air and add all the mid-range back in that you're getting rid of in the middle because there's nothing else out there. So out on the sides, you're dealing with maybe some guitars, but in the middle, you're dealing with bass, kick, and vocal. And really start thinking about your EQ that way instead of just having a left and a right. Because when you're EQing a stereo piano left and right, really, you're probably just making up for the fact that the microphones sound different because they were in different parts of the piano. Instead of just treating it as a stereo instrument and saying, well, what else is in the sound field in different places? And so exactly the same thing with overheads, exactly the same thing on a mix. There are times, there's a preset, it's actually the very first preset I did when I got the MS version of the plugin. What it does is it adds low end to the middle, adds air to the sides, and I believe it even high passes the sides a little bit. And it just spreads the mix out, not as much as, let's say, an S1 would do, because that's starting to do it with phase and give you psychoacoustic spread, but it actually will widen the apparent stereo field of the mix because it just gets rid of some mess that draws you back into the middle. It makes it a little bit less mono because the EQ of the middle is different from the EQ of the sides. And it accentuates what you've probably tried to accentuate already. You don't necessarily want a ton of top end right in the middle because you've got your vocal, so that air will be sitting there, but you don't want to make everything else really bright. But there's nothing wrong with getting the top of the acoustic guitars and the cymbals to come up, but maybe taking out a little bit of the rumble that's going on the sides while adding a little bit of the thump that you've got on the kick and the bass. So once you get your head around it, it's just an awesome way to think about EQing, and it has nothing to do with the standard sort of stereo EQ. It's a totally different way to think about it.